Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news lines we have for you this week, the protective effects of being vaccinated for COVID-19 and the way it can prevent certain autoimmune diseases. A bacteria in your mouth reproduce in a rather distinct and separate way to most other instances of bacterial reproduction. The best theoretical way to lose weight, even if it's not the best practical way to lose weight. The ABC in Australia, their national broadcaster, goes completely off the deep end trying to promote the use of non-practical ways of getting rid of weeds. The fascination America has with rather big cars and the fact that there is a very obvious downside to this, and no, it's not the increase in fuel consumption. A mathematical proof that Middle Earth is not flat, and mobile phones do not cause brain cancer, or at least a major study says so. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the benefits of being vaccinated, and then following that, boosters to your vaccination when it comes to autoimmune disease and COVID-19. Now, it may have been nearly 5 years now since COVID-19 came to be, hence the name, but the effects it has continue to tell, particularly as new variants come about and people get infected again. One of the biggest concerns has been something like, say, long COVID, where you have very obvious effects on your health and well-being, but there are other concerns that are just as, if not more important. One of these is the fact it can trigger autoimmune diseases. Now, we knew about some of these very early on the period leading into and the major periods of lockdown for COVID-19, but we didn't exactly know how much effect there was. With 5 years of data and various other things, we have a better idea, but not perfectly so. This is where one Singaporean study involving nearly 1.8 million adults shows us that having a booster significantly lowers the risk of autoimmune diseases. And rather obviously, the inverse of that is somewhat true. That is, not being vaccinated or not having boosters for it increases the risk. Now, the kinds of diseases we're talking about are actually not what you might think of. One of the immediate ones they've identified is inflammatory bowel diseases. Another is skin disorders. And there are others again. But it does raise issues around what exactly is happening. You might wonder, well, is there some sort of particular spin on this? And honestly, not really. There was admittedly an interesting demographic split in the cohort, but overall that shouldn't really change too much. Despite that, there are some other concerns with the study, mostly the fact that it is just observational. But even if we're talking about this as a purely observational study and the fact that there are different variants on COVID-19 that they were looking at different times, it does seem to be fairly solid. This brings us to another observational study, but this one looked at the use of cannabis and the changes in your genetics, particularly epigenetic changes. Now, epigenetic changes are distinct from regular genetic mutations that you might think of. For example, something that will cause cancer is typically going to be a genetic mutation, that is, alteration in the nucleotides that make up your gene. The actual genetics themselves are modified. Epigenetics is something that goes, as the name would suggest, above those. Oftentimes something like RNA that regulates the function or methylation of those genes, something to that effect, which is where it becomes key to look at the difference between direct causes and epigenetic changes. And this is where the direct cause, cannabis, causing the direct alteration of epigenetics is important and distinctly separate from genetics themselves. There is, before we get into the details, a few issues around the study. First of all, it's only 1,000 individuals, and they are all adults with long-term use of cannabis. So there are some questions around how much you can extrapolate this out and how reliable it is given that they've been using cannabis for, a long time. The other issue is that it's a 20-year study, but blood samples are only taken at the 15 and 20-year point. This means there's a fairly large period of time preceding the blood samples and between blood samples. Despite this, it's not necessarily the case that what they found isn't right. For instance, the methylation that they were focusing on is actually a reasonably common genetic trait passed on to offspring. For example, if you're a daughter, you will have certain genes inherited from your father and your mother. For the most part, at least one of these will need to be turned off, and this will be done via methylation. So it is in theory possible that various changes that have been driven by cannabis use could be inherited. So it's not without merit, just that it's a relatively small study for what it is. The very long research made short, longer cannabis use was associated with significantly more markers tied to the genetic changes that they were looking at, the epigenetic changes they were looking at. Short-term use, significantly fewer. Interestingly, at least one of these is a change that has been closely associated with the use of tobacco, which may indicate that there's some commonality in exactly how it's consumed, or at least the effect it's having. In other health-related news, we have microbial organisms, but those on your tongue and particularly in your mouth, the oral cavity bacteria. Now, while you may not be a dog, necessarily, you will certainly have bacteria in your mouth, just like a dog. But the way the human body's developed over time and evolved, we have ways of controlling it. For example, mucus or saliva. There are various antibodies within our mouth, and of course the fact that we're constantly mechanically processing things in there to try and consume them. It means the amount of bacteria is kept fairly well in check, but that doesn't mean we get rid of all of it. There is some there at all times, and so you have to ask, how does it proliferate? The findings from one study at least is that the bacteria that live in the dental plaque on your teeth, rather than dividing into two daughter cells like most mitoses or meioses will involve, or in the case of microbes, cellular division, instead they undergo what is called a multiple fission. The name suggests obviously what it is. That is, rather than dividing into two cells, they divide into multiple cells, sometimes as many as up to 14 at a time. They're kind of like Irish Catholic families, making as many kids as they can, and then hoping that they survive. The bacteria in particular that we're looking at here, called C. matricoti, is particularly faster growing, and it can grow by up to, say, 0.5 millimeter each day. Understand, that's really fast, at least by terms in microbiology. On the other hand, it also means that it may be compensating for its lack of mobility. It doesn't have flagella, it can't move itself around, so it has to grow fast in order to outcompete anything else that's in the area. The other thing here is, though, other than the fact that it's fast growing and the fact that it divides weirdly, it provides a lot of the necessary structural elements that other bacteria would be using in your mouth to be able to grow. They basically provide the structural element, the mesh and framework in which all of the other various microorganisms begin to do what they do. By itself, it's not a particularly exciting development necessarily. Weird and wonderful, yes, but not particularly useful at the moment. But it is something that's inside all of us to start with, and also may yet prove useful in the relatively distant future. In very immediately useful microbiological news, we have California. Well, no, California is not a microbial disease, but it's been infected by one. No, not Californians. The bird flu. The bird flu, or avian influenza, has now spread to California, which is just great, because California is responsible for about 20% of America's dairy cows. So, California will now have to fight off the issue of homeless pooping in their streets, terrible politicians, people living in Silicon Valley, the smugness, and, well, avian influenza. The list of things they have to deal with just keeps on growing. You'd think that they'd get over this and just embrace the crazy, but hopefully not. Less snide news has the significance of this in terms of what it's going to do to the food supply. Like other states, we see exactly the same problem with dairy cows. That is, infection with avian influenza reduces milk production. Lower milk production means, obviously, less milk, but it also means less butter, less ice cream, and any other dairy products like yogurt and cheese. This means since March of this year, avian influenza has spread all the way from North Carolina on the east coast, all the way across to California on the west coast of America. And yes, it does appear to have skipped certain states in between, but there's a fairly substantial rate at which it's going from one side to the other, and the impact that it's having will be felt sooner or later. with already 14 out of the roughly 50 US states having been, infected. In other food-related news, we have what is supposed to be that surprising dieting news. Dieting news that having a plant-based diet is good for you. Well, it's good for you if you don't want any friends. After all, being a vegan is basically one way to lose any and all people who want to deal with you. In a less cynical news, though, the reality is that yes, plant-based diets are good for you. And yes, they do have a variety of health benefits, but they're also useful for losing weight. The problem with this is that theoretically they work extremely well. In practice, people enjoy the taste of meat and other plant and animal products. So for example, replacing your steak with a mushroom might sound good in theory, but in practice it doesn't work. Same with replacing your ice cream, say, with a smoothie or something similar. People just aren't going to go with this. And it's something the review article that this was made into should be saying, yet it doesn't, because they're only focusing on the positives. The review article, of course, having looked at 24 other much more significant and original research, and then tried to follow up what happens to the roughly 2,200 people. And, well, yeah, the reality is, as said, it may work for you. It's just you won't have any friends and nobody will actually do it if they have a choice in the matter. Slightly more useful agricultural news is a way to reduce the particularly fast fashion industry's environmental impact. And the way this is done is by taking potato fibre and combining it with other fibres, preferably natural fibres, and basically making it more sustainable, or at least more sustainable in that it will break down more readily. The way it works is very simple. A potato does have a certain amount of fibre in it. When you extract this fibre and combine it with, say, cotton or similar natural fibres, you get a product that, if not well looked after, for example if thrown out as rubbish, will break down much quicker. And therein lies the key to it. By having a much more biodegradable product, or fabric, you're able to more effectively recycle it or compost it, as is the case, and thereby provide a lot of the necessary benefit for fast fashion, that is, a quick turnover and relatively cheap material to build it, but then also not contribute to global waste. That alone sounds kind of awesome, except there's not a lot of potatoes that are really useful for that, or at least not typically. And herein lies the major key to this research. Whereas the potatoes that you could use for this, you might be thinking of your typical potato, for example, the thing you might buy in the supermarket. That's not what they're targeting here. Rather, what they're targeting here are the potatoes that can't be used either for humans or animals. One of the best candidates for that are potatoes that have started to green. That greening of the potato indicates that they developed a greater amount of solanine, and that's a poison in case you're unaware. And because of that, they can't be fed to animals because, well, poisoning animals is a bad idea. And of course, you can't give them to humans because poisoning humans gets you put in jail. So how do you use this? Well, as one startup intends to do, is take those greening potatoes, or potatoes that have a high amount of solanine, and extract all of the fibre that you can out of them, combine this with cotton, and create a new sustainable fabric. Now, again, it sounds great, just understand that it does come with a whole range of issues. One of the simplest is, well, you need to convince people that this new fabric is worth investing in and using. Second, you need to be able to demonstrate that there is a demand for what you're making from it. And finally, you actually need to have a supply of potatoes. Now, you don't necessarily need potatoes themselves, but the stems of the plant that produces the potato might be just as, if not more effective, meaning in theory, you could be able to take the potato as it is in the ground in a tuber, send that off to be sold for food, but then take the actual plant that grows above the ground and process that to get your sustainable fabric, or at least part thereof. This newest area should be called potato fashion. In other news related to, well, particularly agriculture, but the supposed best ways to deal with weeds in gardens, and this is coming from Australia's very liberal national broadcaster. What they're claiming is a range of methods that are better than using herbicides to get rid of your weeds, which is kind of ridiculous. Herbicides are the best way to get rid of your weeds, but let's go through what they're suggesting. First, boiling water and vinegar. And yes, boiling water can indeed work for this, but vinegar not so much, as it will acidify the soil somewhat. But boiling water, yes, will definitely destroy any roots, assuming they don't grow deep, at which point you actually have another problem, because all you've really done is destroy the part of the plant near the surface, but the boiling water won't penetrate very deeply into the ground. Mulch is a very obvious and very effective method, simply because you not only provide the benefit of suffocating whatever it is that's growing there, but you keep water within the soil, and as such, you don't need to water as often or as much. So yes, again, that makes more sense. And next they suggest more plants, that is, planting things more extensively, and yes, to an extent, outcompeting what's there would work to an extent. Admittedly, it depends very much on what you're doing. For example, if it's a garden bed where you're trying to grow vegetables, planting more things doesn't work, it's just not viable. Whereas if, say, it's a lawn, well, you already have grass and you can't plant much more than grass there. So this is a very niche solution. But the problem we have is where they suggest avoiding the use of herbicides. No, herbicides are perfectly effective, they are in fact very reliable and very safe. Suggesting not to use them is just plain silly. But not using weed matting, yes, we agree 100%. Weed matting is a waste of your time and money. It honestly only lasts for a short period of time before weeds find their way through or start growing on top of it. In other environment-related news, but this time coming out of the UCLA, we have dumb publications. This is a article of sorts trying to argue that same-sex couples are more vulnerable to the negative effects of climate change. No, nothing about them makes them more vulnerable. In fact, they're at exactly the same risk as everybody else, because they are human, just like everybody else. Despite what some of the nutters, ultra-conservatives, religious fanatics and so on might argue, they are people, and they are just as vulnerable to the various changes that occur due to climate change. But let's operate on the idea that maybe UCLA has something going here that we should be aware of. Well, what they are arguing is that due to the various mapping systems available out there, say through NASA or FEMA, there are areas that are at greater risk of effect from changes due to climate change. These areas also have a higher risk of same-sex couples. For example, you're more likely to find more people who are in a same-sex relationship in somewhere like San Francisco or New York than you are, say, in the middle of Arkansas or Nebraska or something similar. As such, these people would be more affected by it. Now, this has less to do with the fact they're a same-sex couple, and more the fact that they just live somewhere more likely to be affected by this. They're putting the cart before the horse in a very major way. This would be like, for instance, saying that Muslim people are more likely to be affected by sandstorms, because the predominant majority of Muslim people live in countries that are arid and full of deserts. The fact that they're Muslim isn't really what drives this. Rather, it's just that that's where they live. It's not one drives the other, they're completely unrelated events. But like with the UCLA, they've linked the two in that argument example, without any actual relationship between the two. In some ways, this is linked to the next news item, and it's from The Economist, and it points out that America, and particularly American drivers, have a fondness for very large, heavy cars. Now, these large, heavy cars are great for the drivers. They have them protected because, well, a bigger thing squishes smaller thing, much like, say, rock beats scissors. The issue here is not so much that the big cars are safe for the individuals inside, rather, if the drivers of these large vehicles have an accident, whoever's on the receiving end of this accident in the smaller vehicle is going to have a very bad time. A typically deathly bad time. And that's the issue here. The argument has been that because Americans like their big cars, and typically those people driving the big car tend to be driving alone or with one or two other passengers, the vehicles that are smaller that they hit tend to have many more people inside, and so the vehicles that are saving lives are actually taking more than they save. Or at least that seems to be the argument. Now, there are various reasons why the consumers will be choosing to purchase bigger cars, which is the car maker's argument, but nonetheless, it's not really a case of linking the two necessarily. Yes, there's a corollary, and has been well established over 30 years, between bigger cars hitting smaller cars and smaller cars generally becoming worse off because of that, but that doesn't really explain what's going on. In fact, The Economist sort of jumps from the initial idea of two different sized vehicles, accidents and death, to big cars just bad. No, there's a range of factors that come into play, particularly when we talk about smaller cars. And as such, the article and the arguments within it, they're really not that great. And next we have what is honestly, simultaneously, not that surprising, but also a unfortunate reality check for a lot of people who want to go into biological research. And it's demonstrated from a X post showing various Reddit posts. It's that people in the research field, particularly biology research, basically spend their entire career engaging in basically a eugenics program against mice. They go through, they raise them up, they feed them, they breed them, they make more mice for this, that, or the other, and then they go and kill them for various research purposes, and it is leading to a very high rate of burnout. And unfortunately for some people, they're just not ready for it, and in some cases, even if they're ready initially, the toll it takes on their psyche is just so bad that they can't keep doing it. It's worth making the point that if you're engaged in research, and it can be all kinds of biological, biochemical, chemical, psychiatric, or any other research, that you are going to work at some point with mice. Now, it may only be, say, 20 or 30 if it's a very small project, or it could be hundreds or even thousands in some cases, depending on how long the project goes for and how extensive it is. And there's every chance in the world, if not an absolute chance, that at some point the mice involved will be killed. Ideally euthanized, but depending on the kind of research involved, that may or may not happen the way it's planned. And as such, that people, partly become attached to their research mice, but also, once you start killing them, it does begin to take more of a toll. And particularly if the kind of research you're doing is ethically fraught, let's say. As such, a lot of them, or at least a lot of those people involved, tend to find themselves unable to manage after a period of time. And, well, as mentioned at the start of this section, there's a range of Reddit posts showing just exactly this issue. That is, people just can't cope in the long term, and understandably so. In much lighter news, we have a mathematical proof that Middle-earth is not flat, as has been shown in just about every depiction, and even by Tolkien's own words, let's say. That instead of being flat, it is in fact a globe. Which is interesting, because that would mean that rather than having to try and go one way to Middle-earth, theoretically the elves, the Valar, and everybody else could have gone the other way around and got into the other side and basically got Mordor on the back. But it's nonetheless interesting to see that there's a mathematical proof that Middle-earth is indeed a sphere. Now we have another argument, other than that the Eagles could have just taken the ring to Mordor. We have the idea that they could have gone in the back of Mordor and dropped it into Mount Doom from there. Having now aggravated all of the Tolkien fans with that particularly bad take, let's look at other news that could have taken them across the ocean. It's the world's largest sailing cargo ship. And yes, we have literally come full circle now. From having made sailing ships, to steam engines with giant paddles, to turbine-powered engines, to sailing ships, again. Now, the sailing ship in this case isn't actually necessarily useful. It does have benefits, to be clear, but it also has some fairly major downsides. The first benefit, so to say, is that it doesn't require any fuel, or at least as far less fuel than a standard ship would. Therefore, its environmental footprint is much smaller, about 10% that of a comparable container ship. The downsides are that, well, it's a comparable container ship, therefore they would probably be much larger, particularly looking at the side of it, given it's only got 2 masts. The next issue is that, well, by comparison to a powered ship, this is slower to start with, and if there's no wind, you don't go anywhere. You are becalmed. And finally, the fact that, well, now that we're back to using sailing ships, Britain is starting to feel a bit cramped and constrained once more. And they're thinking, India seems very lonely over there. Maybe they need some colonialism once more. in new technology being just like old technology, except in this case, it's new research showing what we've known for a long time now. Mobile phones don't cause cancer. Wow, thank you, World Health Organization. You've just revealed the deepest and most unknown aspects of the advanced research in the world. It's cutting edge. No, wait, this was known more than a decade ago, and has basically never been proven otherwise since. It's exactly the same reason that we've said previously. Overhead power lines don't cause any kind of cancer or other issues with your health for that matter. EMF, or electromagnetic frequencies, cannot cause harm. It's just a physical impossibility given the nature of what they are, the doses you receive, and so on. The only possible exception would be if you literally duct taped a phone to your head at its most powerful setting and tried to broadcast a frequency continuously, and even then flex tape probably couldn't fix this issue. But let's at least look at what the World Health Organization has to say, as much as it's worth it anyway. Yes, radiation can cause cancer. There are issues around dose, exposure time, and so on, so there are certain things you need to consider when saying this. And so, when you look at radio waves, you can consider them a possible carcinogen. Again, remembering, you would basically need to have this thing strapped to you, pumping out its most powerful signal it possibly can. And for most people, that's not the case. This is where the interferon study comes into play. It was basically started in 2011 and looked at what was going on. And they were trying to figure out if between 1994 and 2022, and the 5,000 or so studies that had been published, and 63 of which were actually worth looking at, was there actually a relationship, particularly if we look at, say, their own study, these other studies and everything else brought together? And the answer is no. Between the male cancer rates, female cancer rates, and prevalence of mobile phone usage, for example in Australia, there is no relationship. The cancer rates have more or less remained relatively stagnant, whereas mobile phone usage has skyrocketed. Understand, between 1994 and 2008, mobile phone usage jumped from roughly 0 per person to 1 per person, or just under. And so basically everybody has a mobile phone in Australia as of 2008. The thing is, the amount of cancer, at least the rate of cancer in that same time frame, did not change. So you would think that if more people are using more mobile phones, you would expect to see some kind of effect. But okay, what if there was a delay? Let's say for whatever reason, the cancer takes time to occur. Well, in the 6 years that followed that, still no change. Literally, the rate of cancer fluctuated within the same roughly 5 and 6 in 100,000 people for females, and roughly 7.5 and 9 for males per 100,000 males. So, no. Mobile phones don't cause cancer. Finally, we have how we can fight back against bad information, particularly bad information driven by large language models, or effectively the things you see sold as AI now. So think of, say, ChatGPT. The idea here is that they can be used to push back against misinformation, various science deniers like anti-vaxxers, and other crazy conspiracy nutters. And it can be done using exactly the same tools they're using, just to the contrary. The exact description from science-based medicine is fighting fire with fire, which isn't so far off the truth, but it seems a little bit inaccurate. The strengths and weaknesses of this kind of vary a lot, and especially based on what you consider success. In this case, the biggest successes are that it can be used, it's just not very accurate. The downside is it's not very accurate. In fact, it has some serious issues to do with false positives, that is marking man-made content as made by machines, and inversely marking machine content as legitimate human material. And of course, that also would indicate that a lot of the crazy anti-science crowd are really only repeating the same bullshit, which tells you just how much of an NPC they can be at times. The thing is that although we say that, it's actually interesting that the way humans present misinformation tends to be much harder for these large language models to detect than it is for large language model generated misinformation to be detected. And that would mean that either there's a much more creative use of language, which is probably likely, or that the way the information is presented is so detached from reality that, well, LLMs just can't figure out what it is. This brings the science-based medicine blog post to three major things that we agree with very much. That is, there needs to be a better and more robust developed way of misinformation being detected by these, intervening in their production and dissemination, and attributing whether or not it is made by something like ChatGPT, for instance, thereby allowing for the purveyors of this bad information to not only be named and shamed, but ideally their laziness to be aired out to the entire public, and it's well understood that they're not actually doing their own work and spreading their own misinformation. They're just claiming the credit from something like, say, ChatGPT. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.